Everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We did promise in the invitation that Caroline Schultz, our executive director, would be joining us today, but unfortunately she can't. So you're stuck with me, and it will be my pleasure to introduce you to James Paterson. But first, I wanted to share a very heartfelt thank you to you, our members. Your support really enables our work, and we couldn't do what we do without your support, so thank you so much. I hope you've gotten to spend some time in nature this spring and summer, even if we haven't been able to gather like we normally would with our nature clubs. As you can see by my background here, our team are still working remotely, but our office opened 2 weeks ago, and we're rotating staff in so we can work there safely and just with a few people in the office. But our conservation staff have been in the field and working out in the field at our nature reserves through the spring and summer. I'm really looking forward to this webinar. Over the next hour, you're going to be learning about the life history, identification features, threats, and other interesting facts about snakes in Ontario. But before we do that, I wanted to mention that we're planning another series of webinars, which are going to be virtual tours of our nature reserves this fall. So you'll be able to join our conservation staff at Pelee Island to see some birds, orchids on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, and turtles on the Frontenac Arch. So we're really looking forward to that and hope you can join. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce James Paterson. James is an ecologist and a conservation biologist at Trent University. He has been studying reptiles and amphibians for 12 years, and his current research is testing how habitat loss and road mortality affect reptiles and amphibians, and using data from Ontario Nature's Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. We're very excited to be publishing the Atlas soon, which includes data gathered from over 12,000 researchers, naturalists, and citizen scientists across the province. And I'm guessing that many of you have submitted your own herp sightings to the Atlas, and these are really vital to informing our conservation work. So thank you for being a part of this project. James is sort of infamous amongst Ontario Nature staff because he was leading a field trip at one of our annual gatherings several years ago, and it was at Chaffee's Locks in the Frontenac Arch, and he saw a water snake in the river, and without hesitation dived in fully clothed after this snake, and the snake responded by biting him, and I understand that James very calmly described the identification features of the snake while he was sort of bleeding down his arms. So I don't think this webinar today will be as dangerous for James, but we're looking forward to it nonetheless. So thank you, James, for sharing your knowledge with us, and over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm just gonna share my screen again here. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm very excited to share some of my passionate statements about the snakes of Ontario. Just to give you a roadmap for where we're going, I'm going to talk a little bit about snake biology, why we should care about snakes and why they're in trouble, and then we're going to spend some time learning about how to identify the different species in Ontario. And then we're going to finish with just some more extra resources where you can find more information, just because we can't cover everything in half an hour to 40 minutes. Snakes evolved as a group about 143 million years ago, and some of them are very small. On the right, you can see a very small New Mexico thread snake, which is the size of an earthworm. And on the left, you can see one of the bigger snakes, a boa constrictor that's got a 3-foot iguana in its grasp. And so snakes vary a lot in size, but all of them are carnivores. out of the snakes that are still alive, less than 20% are venomous. And here I'm using venomous in a way that's medically relevant to humans. So very few of them can cause damage to humans. They reproduce in many different ways. Many of them lay eggs, but actually many species, including many that occur in Ontario, are ovoviviparous, so they actually give live birth. Now, there are many snakes in the world, about 3,600 different species. And in Canada, due to our cold climate, we get only a small percentage of that. So there are 26 species in Canada, and of those, 15 occur in Ontario. Now, I think we should care about snakes because they're just super cool animals, but they also form incredibly important ecosystem roles. So they're important predators of many species that we would consider pests. So mice and other small mammals that eat our crops or can pass disease on to us. And so they form really important roles in the ecosystem. But also, many of them are in trouble. So in Ontario, more than half of our snakes are at risk of disappearing and have been listed as at risk by our Provincial Endangered Species Act. And so we need to do more to learn about these species and try to take action to conserve them. The number one threat to snakes in Ontario, but also in the world, is the loss of habitat. And so in Southern Ontario especially, we've converted a large portion of the land to agricultural fields. We've built a large number of roads, and all of our cities are expanding. And so this southern part of the province that has the warmest climate is where most people live, but it's also where the highest diversity of snakes occur. And that brings snakes and people into conflict. So I took this photo last year of an eastern hognose snake. This is a threatened species. I think it captures the tension and conflict between snake people. So this is a snake that uses often sand dune habitat to hunt toads. And you can see behind the snake, there's a cottage. And in order for the snake to get to its preferred dune habitat, it's got to cross through someone's front yard and go around their cottage to look for food. The rest of the year, the snake might spend in a forest habitat, and that's behind me where I took this photo. And behind me is a busy road that the snake is going to risk its life to try to cross. And so we need to find ways for snakes and people to coexist. And in order for that to happen, we need to know a little bit more about where these populations occur. And so a really good way to do that is, as Kristen mentioned, the Ontario Reptile Amphibian Atlas, which is a community science project where people submit sightings. And you can see by the number of species of reptiles and amphibians reported, there are places in the province that have a much higher diversity. And so my research is using some of this data to try to identify where species still occur, and also where species are most at risk of disappearing. So for a community science program to be successful, we need to be able to identify the snakes. And so now we're going to talk a bit more about how to identify the snakes of Ontario and talk a bit more about their life history. I think the two most useful ways to identify snakes is first to look at how large a snake is.
Hi, James. Sorry to interrupt. I just turned off your video just because the sound was a little bit choppy. I think hopefully this should resolve it. Failing that, I'll put the presentation on my share mode.
Okay, sounds good. So we're going to use the size of the snake to identify it But instead of trying to estimate the exact size, it's most useful to group snakes into maybe small or very large. So I like to think about, is the snake as long as a pencil, or is it closer to a meter stick in length? The next most useful thing to think about is the pattern on the snake. Is it a solid color, and does it have stripes that run from head to tail, or does it have spots and blotches on it? And so by combining both the size and the pattern, and also occasionally where you see the snake, we're going to be able to identify what species it is. And so today I've grouped our snakes into 3 groups. What I call the stripy snakes, the small snakes, and then the larger, mostly blotchy snakes. We're going to start with the group of snakes which have stripes. So the most common and abundant and wide species of snake in Ontario is the eastern garter snake. So they're found in a wide variety of habitats, and you can identify them. They're usually black with 3 yellow stripes. 1 on the top side and 1 on each side. Hi everyone. Seems I was disconnected.
I'm just going to share my screen here, James, and hopefully that reduces the strain on your internet and resolves the sound issue as well. So can you just remind me what slide you were on?
I think if we start at the eastern garter snake, I'm not sure where I cut off for others.
Yeah, I think it was right about there. Okay, I think you're good to go now. I'll just mute myself.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Sean. And I'll give you a heads up when I want to switch slides. Okay, so eastern garter snakes can come in a wide variety of colors. And so on the right, you can see a melanistic form where the snake is actually lacking all stripes. So in some places, garter snakes are solid black, but usually they always have those 3 stripes, even if there's variation in how much color they have. So on the left, you can see the snake has much more red. So now we're going to move on to our next striped snake. So John, if you can go to the next slide. So the eastern ribbon snake is the race car of snakes that we have in Ontario. They're a little more specialized in habitat than eastern garter snakes. They tend to be found around wetlands and other aquatic habitat because they specialize on eating frogs, tadpoles, and occasionally fish. So one of the ways to distinguish the ribbon snake from the eastern garter snake is if you can see on the close-up of the head on the left photo, there's a white crescent in front of the eye, and there's a white chin. And so that's a good way to distinguish eastern ribbon snakes from eastern garter snakes. This species is about the same size as a garter snake, but they tend to be a little bit thinner. John, can you go to the next slide? Okay. The other similar striped snake, which can be confusing, is the Butlers garter snake. They're an endangered species, and so they only occur in a small part of Ontario, in southwestern Ontario around Windsor to Sarnia. And this snake One of the best ways to distinguish it is that it has a much smaller head. Okay? And they specialize on eating invertebrates, especially worms. And so they have a much smaller head compared to the eastern garter snake. But the best way to distinguish our garter snakes and ribbon snakes from each other is actually to look at where the stripe occurs on the side of the body. So John, if you go to the next slide. So on the diagram on the right, you can actually see that the body of a snake, you can divide the scales into rows. And where the stripe occurs on the side of the body is a distinguishing feature for telling the difference between these snakes. And so eastern garter snake, the stripe extends from the first row to the third row. On eastern ribbon snake, it's higher and just on rows 3 and 4. And on Butlers garter snakes, the stripe is centered on scale row 3, but extends onto 2 and 4. And so this is obviously very hard to see if the snake is moving quickly, but if you can get a photo of the side of the snake, you can then afterwards count the scale rows going up from the belly to be able to distinguish between them. And so we have one more stripy snake that is not a garter snake. John, if you can go to the next slide. And that is the queen snake. This is an aquatic snake that specializes on eating freshly molted crayfish. So it's only found in clear and clean rivers, streams, creeks, and occasionally lakes. And it can be confused with the other striped snakes because it has that yellowish stripe on the sides of its body. But it is the only snake in Ontario that has stripes that run down the belly of the snake. So you can see the photo on the left. That's a distinguishing feature. And you can also see that it's got a clean white chin, but it does not have the crescent that a ribbon snake does. So again, these are relatively thin and small snakes, but they only occur in southern Ontario in clean rivers and sometimes lakes. And this is an endangered species. John, thanks. So the next group, we're gonna look at small snakes. And when I say small snakes, I generally mean smaller than a ruler, 30 centimeters, but some of the species can be a bit longer. But that's relatively rare. They can extend to be about 1/2 meter. So next slide. I'm gonna start with one of our most tolerant snakes. This is Decays brown snake, or the little brown snake. They can be light to dark brown, and they specialize on eating invertebrates such as slugs, so they're good to have around your garden. And they also eat things like earthworms. These are live-bearing snakes, and so the babies are actually really tiny. The photo on the top right is a newborn snake that would fit easily in the palm of my hand. And the way to distinguish Decays brown snakes, they have a pair of dark markings that run down the top of the snake. So you can see in all 3 photos, you can see those dark brown blotches that are on the top of the snake in pairs. Let's go to our next species. The ringneck snake is a very secretive and nocturnal snake. These are egg layers. And the body is blue-gray, but sometimes it can almost appear black. And they have a bright ring around their neck that's the same color as their belly. And so the color can range from orange or red, as you can see in the larger photo, to a much paler yellow color, as you can see in the smaller photo. These snakes are thought in Ontario to mostly eat salamanders, but this species actually extends all the way into northern Mexico, and further south, they actually get much larger than they do here. So I've held a 3-foot-long ringneck snake before from Arizona. And further south, they eat snakes and lizards, but in Ontario, they probably eat small salamanders, such as redback salamanders. And they're mostly nocturnal, so the way you see ringneck snakes is typically under cover, such as under rocks, logs, or boards. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the red-bellied snake is another one of our small brown snakes. It looks similar to Decays little brown snake or Decays brown snake, but it has a bright red belly. And the English common name, red-bellied snake, is very good for describing what's underneath the snake. But if you don't pick it up, you might not see the red belly. And the snake's Latin name actually is the better descriptor for the top of the snake. The species name is Occipido maculata, which means occipido is back of the head and maculata is spot. So you can see the photo on the top left. It's got that bright spot in the back of the head. That's a good distinguishing feature if you're trying to compare red-bellied snakes to Decays brown snakes. And again, these are typically about pencil length to maybe the size of a ruler. And you'd often see them under cover, such as if you flip over some firewood or a rotting log or a rock. And they eat earthworms and slugs and other invertebrates. Let's go to our next small snake. This is one of our most brightly colored snakes, the smooth green snake. It's a very good common name because they are both smooth and green. These snakes specialize on eating invertebrates such as spiders, and their color is very good at camouflaging them in fields and along the edges of wetlands and wet prairies where they live. These are actually egg layers. So they lay eggs, sometimes communally, that hatch in a very short amount of time. And snake eggs, unlike most turtle eggs, are very leathery. And so they're usually quite soft. Smooth green snakes can be very hard to find, but again, this is a snake that you might see under cover, and occasionally you'll see if you're moving around in grassy fields or wetlands. And this is grouped with the small snakes, but they can occasionally be longer and be up to about a half a meter long. So that wraps up our second group of snakes, are small snakes. And the last group is probably the most difficult and has the most species. These are larger snakes that are usually blotchy, but occasionally solid color. Let's go to the next slide. So the northern water snake comes in a variety of colors, but they're typically brown to black, and they often have a dark coloring. So you can see from this photo, the snake almost occurs as a solid color, and the younger ones typically are more blotched. You often see water snakes basking along the edges of shorelines, and this is a very thick-bodied snake. So often you'll see really thick groups of them basking in July and August, and those are typically large females. These are live-bearing snakes, and so the females are trying to get nice and warm to incubate their babies before they give birth. They typically hunt fish, but often we have lots of sightings, especially to the Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, of snakes occasionally catching mud puppies, which are aquatic salamanders, and then bringing them to shore to swallow them whole. Water snakes typically get a bad reputation for being a little bitey, as in Kristen's story of me catching one a few years ago, but they're non-venomous. And so it looks bad when the snake tries to bite you, but their teeth are very small and cause very little damage. And I think it's fair that a snake, any animal that you grab that's wild, has a right to bite you in self-defense. Let's move to the next slide. So we actually have a second kind of water snake that's endangered. The Lake Erie water snake is not a separate species, but it is a subspecies of the northern water snake. And so it only occurs in western Lake Erie. So on Pelee Island and some of the other small islands which are uninhabited by people. They can be kind of distinguished from northern water snakes. They typically have more gray coloring to match the rocks that occur in the shorelines there. but usually you can't distinguish them visually from northern water snakes. The way you distinguish the water snakes are just whether you're on one of the islands in Lake Erie or whether you're on the mainland in Ontario. Let's go to our next slide. I wanted to move to another rare snake since we're talking about Lake Erie and Pelee Island. The blue racer in Canada only occurs on Pelee Island. And so unless you're on Pelee Island, you're not going to see this species. This is a long, fast, and active hunting predator. You can see that it's got big eyes, and they're solid blue to gray color as adults, and they can be quite long, over 1.5 meters. But as babies, they're blotchy. So you can see the photo on the bottom right. They're gray to brown with brown blotches. And so the young can often be confused with some of our other blotchy species. And these are egg layers. And so you'll see the blotchy juveniles in the late summer after they hatch. And as they become adults, they turn more to the solid blue-gray color. Although they're endangered in Canada, they're quite widespread and common in most of the eastern United States. So they're just reaching their northern limit in Canada. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks. This is my favorite snake in Ontario, the eastern fox snake. This is a very Ontario or Canada specific species because a large part of its range is in Ontario. These are large, relatively large, thick-bodied snakes. They're very good at climbing. And so they'll climb up trees where they can hunt bird nests, but they're also very good at finding rodent nests. So they're a good snake to have around your cottage. They are gold color with brown blotches. And you can see from the head color, they are often nicknamed as copperhead snakes, as like a slang term. I don't like to use that because copperhead refers to a different species of venomous snake that occurs in the United States, where eastern fox snakes are non-venomous. They are harmless snakes. They occur in 2 separate places in Ontario. The first is in southwestern Ontario from Windsor and along the Lake Erie shoreline. And then there's a separate population that occurs in eastern Georgian Bay. They're very good swimmers and they can swim between many of the islands in Georgian Bay. And so you'll also notice that this snake changes color quite a bit from the babies when they hatch. The photo on the top right, you can see they're more brown and gray as juveniles, and as they become adults, they take on that yellowish and darker brown color. And this is a snake that can get well over 1 meter long, and they're usually quite thick or robust. Let's move on to the next slide. This is a snake that I talked about earlier, the eastern hognose snake. It's named for the upturned scale, which is on the top of its nose. And this snake uses that scale to actually dig in open sand. It digs for primarily 2 reasons. One, it can dig to hunt for its favorite prey, toads. It also digs a hole where it lays its eggs in sandy soil. This snake is really variable in color and pattern. It can range from solid olive color to solid black and then blotches on either of those variations. So you can see the larger snake is almost black with gold markings, and the inset photo is like a more brown colored snake with some blotches. This snake is also the best acting snake in Ontario. When threatened, they can flatten their neck like a cobra, so they can form a bit of a hood. And it will use that and as like a threat display to try to ward off predators. And often, if this doesn't work, the snake will then revert to playing dead. So it will roll over onto its back, belly up. It'll often stick its tongue out, and it will play dead and hope that the predator doesn't want to eat it. So it's a really interesting behavioral adaptation to keep predators away. And so if you ever see one and you're lucky enough to see that display, be grateful, because these snakes can be very hard to find. And they are a threatened species in Ontario. They're egg layers, as I said. So they lay their eggs in mostly sandy soil in June and July. And the other thing about identifying the snakes, since using the pattern is so difficult, one useful thing other than looking for the upturned scale is to look at the body thickness. So these are very, I say stubby snakes. They're very thick bodied for how long they are. Okay, John, let's move on to the next snake. The gray rat snake is Ontario's longest snake, so they can approach 2 meters in length. As adults, they're usually solid black. If you have followed the name of this snake in the last 20 years, you may be confused because it used to be called black rat snake. It was at one point called eastern rat snake, and now is called gray rat snake. So it's the same snakes that occur in Ontario, but the taxonomy for how this species is related to other ones in the United States has been changing in the last several years, and that's why the name has changed. However, the gray is quite a good descriptor of the snakes as juveniles. These are egg-laying snakes, and when they hatch out of the eggs, they are usually a gray color with these dark blotches. You can see a young of the year on the inset photo, and as the snakes age, they take on that more solid black color. This is another snake that is an excellent climber. It's not unusual to spot these snakes very high in trees, where they climb looking for birds' nests to prey on, and also small mammals. So they'll eat chipmunks and small squirrels and other rodents. This is another snake that has a very limited distribution in Ontario. So they're most easily found in Eastern Ontario in the Frontenac region, but there's also a small and very endangered population that occurs around the north shores of Lake Erie. This is a snake that needs forest to live, and so the population in Southern Ontario obviously is very limited by the remaining Carolinian hardwood forest that's there. Let's move on to our next snake. So I saved the two snakes which are probably most commonly confused for the end of this presentation. So the first is a harmless snake, the milk snake. The easiest way to identify a milk snake, if you're looking at a brown blotchy snake, is to think about the body thickness. So I usually describe the milk snake thickness as something close to the thickness of my thumb. They can be up to 1 meter long, but even at that length, they are a relatively thin-bodied snake. And the reason for that is they hunt rodents, and so they need to be able to get into small rodent nests, so they need to be very thin. The photo on the right is an adult milk snake, where they are usually this brown color with these almost chocolate brown blotches on the top sides and the side of the snake, and the blotches have a black outline. On the left photo is a baby milk snake, and often when they're very young, the blotches can take on a reddish color. And we're going to go to the next slide for a second. The slide that the snake is most commonly confused with is our only venomous snake, which is the Eastern Massasauga. It is a pygmy rattlesnake. And compared to the milk snake, this is a much heavier bodied or thicker bodied snake. So if you're comparing them, I usually say the milk snake is around the thickness of my thumb, where a Massasauga around the same length would be like the thickness of my wrist. So they're a thicker snake. the splotches on the top are usually saddle or butterfly shaped. Okay. And yes, the snake usually has a rattle, but the rattle can break off if it hits it against a rock or a log. And newborn baby rattlesnakes can't rattle because they only have one segment on their tail. You can see the photo on the top right is actually a pile of Massasauga babies that was actually in an Ontario nature reserve. We were doing a survey for them, and Massasaugas are live bearing snakes. And so they give birth in the late summer, and often the babies will hang around together for several days. So you might be lucky enough to see a pile of baby Massasaugas together like this. The other thing to look for if you're trying to distinguish Massasauga from the milk snake is the head shape. Massasaugas tend to have more triangular heads. The pupil on the eye is vertical, although I don't recommend trying to get very close to the head of a venomous snake to look at the pupil shape. The other thing I want to note about the close-up of the head of the Massasauga is that they are pit vipers, which means they have an extra hole. You can see there's the eye, and then between the eye and the nostril, there's another hole. That is the pit organ, which the snake uses to hunt for its prey. So it can detect differences in thermal radiation so that it can catch, for example, warm-blooded mice moving across a colder habitat. So these are ambush predators that sit for long periods of time waiting for prey to go by. And so the other thing I will say about identifying Massasaugas compared to some of our other blotchy snakes is that many of the non-venomous snakes will also shake their tail. They don't have rattles at the end of their tail, but when they shake them really quickly and they're in vegetation, such as dead leaves, the sound can appear, or the sound can come across similar to the rattle of a rattlesnake. And so just because a snake is rattling does not mean it's necessarily a rattlesnake. The other thing I'll say about Massasaugas, they are venomous. So you should take caution. Obviously, don't handle them. If you hear a rattle, pause, identify where the snake is rattling, and then take a step backwards so that the snake has space. However, only 2 people have ever been known to be killed by Eastern Massasaugas in Ontario, and both of them did not receive proper medical attention. So if you are bit, make sure you get to a hospital as soon as possible and get treated. Let's go to the next slide. So that finishes our tour of the many snakes of Ontario. And now we've got a few photos that I'm going to try to challenge you on identifying them. So I think John is going to try to pull up. We have a polling question for the first snake. So we're going to give you, about a minute to try to guess what kind of snake it is.
Thanks, James. The results are just rolling in. I'll just give it a couple more seconds.
Yep. Okay, so I can see our poll is closed. And I will say that most people correctly identify the snake as a Decays brown snake. I posted this photo because the snake does have some traits which can be confused with some of our others. First, it does appear like it might have some stripes. And so some garter snakes do have stripes and spots on them. So a garter snake could be confused with them. And it does have the body color, which is, I would say, more similar to a red-bellied snake in many cases. However, you can see that it doesn't have one big blotch, one big spot at the back of the head, which a red-bellied snake would have. And it has those pair of dots that are running down the top of the snake, which does make it a Decays brown snake. So I will applaud those who got it correct. And for those that guessed the others, I sympathize with you because this was a tricky question. So our next photo is now up, and John's going to open the poll. Thank you. Okay, I can see that the poll results are in. And so in this case, this photo is a young eastern fox snake. So this is one of the more confusing things is to distinguish our smaller juveniles of blotchy snakes. And so the reason it's not a milk snake is that a milk snake would have black outlines around the blotches, and also the color of the body and the blotches. So a young milk snake would typically have redder blotches. And also milk snakes are typically very smooth. So if you guessed milk snake or fox snake, those are probably the hardest to distinguish. This is a young eastern fox snake. The reason it has a Q-tip on its head is that we were sampling the snake for a fungal disease. And I can see there were also several that guessed eastern hognose snake. So if you look at the nose, it does have a large scale on the front of its nose, but it's not turned up into that point that an eastern hognose snake would have. So good job, everyone. We're going to move on to our next quiz, photo quiz. All right. Again, I was challenging everyone with this photo. And so I think we actually have a tie between the most people guessing eastern ribbon snake and queen snake, which is good because those are probably the two species this photo looks most similar to. However, this is a queen snake. Notice that in front of the eye, there's not a bright white scale or crescent, which would make it a ribbon snake. So this is actually a queen snake. Also, this snake doesn't have a stripe on the top of its body that a ribbon snake would. So this is a queen snake. Okay, and our last photo quiz. You should now see the photo up there, and John's going to open the poll. Okay, if you answered milk snake, then you are correct. So most people got milk snake correct. To distinguish this from Massasauga rattlesnake, you'll notice that the snake is fairly thin. So it's a thinner bodied snake, which rules out Massasauga. Eastern fox snake, I guess it's hard to tell the size reference. This is an adult milk snake that would be probably at least 70 centimeters long. And so a fox snake that size would be thicker bodied and would also be more yellow in color. And the hognose snake would have an upturned scale and a wider head. So congratulations, everyone. I hope you did well on those quizzes. These photos I presented were maybe more challenging than maybe the typical snake you're going to encounter, but I just wanted you to practice maybe thinking through some of the things that we were talking about in the webinar. And so before I answer questions, I just wanted to provide you guys with some more resources to help you find more information, since I can only get so much across in a short half-hour presentation. The first resource I'm going to point you towards is iNaturalist. Since the Ontario Reptile Amphibian Atlas is now kind of shutting down the data collection stage of the project, I'm going to recommend that as you guys encounter snakes and other species, to report your sightings to iNaturalist so that scientists can continue to use those observations to do really important ecology and conservation work. There is a Herps of Ontario project, so you can submit reptile and amphibian sightings to the project that's going to continue on for the Atlas. iNaturalist you can submit through your web browser or through one of their smartphone apps. If you guys want more information about the snakes we talked about today, the Ontario Nature Atlas Field Guide, which is available at terranature.org/field guide, has detailed information, photos, and range maps for all of the reptiles and amphibians in the province. It's a fantastic resource. It's all free. And that's a great way to get information on species that you've seen in Ontario. The last resource I'm going to point you to is it's a very cool, it's a robot. It's a machine learning Twitter robot. If you guys are using Twitter, you can post a photo of any reptile or amphibian. If you tag what the herp, the bot will automatically respond with a guess of an identification. And the more photos that are submitted, the better the machine learning algorithm is at identifying them. It also responds with a confidence level. So it will say, I'm fairly certain this is a milk snake, or I'm very certain it is a Massasauga rattlesnake. So that's just another resource you can use to identify species. And I think with that, I would be happy to answer some questions. I see some were rolling in through the Q&A as I was talking. John, do you want me to start going through those?
Sure. So yeah, thanks so much, James. That was a great webinar. Sorry everyone for the little bit of sound issues right at the start of it. Sort of Murphy's Law, of course, worked perfectly before when we tested. So I think we've got about, just about 5 minutes, maybe a couple minutes longer than that for questions. And we will be posting a recording of the webinar after. So sure, why don't, how do you want to do it, James? Do you want to just kind of pick and choose some of the questions there, or do you want me to curate it?
I've got them open. So why don't I choose a few and we go through them, and hopefully I can get to all of them. The ones I don't get to, or if you think of more questions, I'm happy to answer them afterwards if folks want to email me or contact me so that I can get them all answered. So just to start here, this is a really good question. How do snakes survive the winter? That's especially challenging in Canada. Our snakes are not freeze tolerant, which means they have to get somewhere below the frost line. And so typically that would be if you're in central Ontario, that would be in a kind of usually called like a snake den, an overwintering site, where they're going to get through a crack in the bedrock so that snakes can get down below the frost line. And often these overwintering sites have multiple species that live in them, and they may travel large distances to get there. In southwestern Ontario, where we don't have bedrock, snakes use other ways to get below the frost line. And so often that might be within crayfish burrows. So snakes will go down a crayfish burrow, arrange themselves so that at least their head is above water so that they can breathe, and then they'll overwinter like that. And so they'll usually go down, depending on the weather and what part of the province you're in October, and they might come up somewhere between March and May, depending on the season and where you are. So that's how snakes survive the winter. They can't freeze. Another snake we have, how much time for babies to grow to adulthood? That's a great question. I didn't really talk about how long some of our snakes live. Some of our snakes can mature in a year or two. Other snakes, it takes much longer. So the large-bodied snakes like rat snakes, hognose, Massasaugas, those take several years. So a rat snake might take 7 years before it's old enough and large enough to breed for the first time, where the smaller bodied snakes, they have a much faster life pace. So they might mature in a year or two. So for example, Butlers garter snakes typically only live a handful of years. So it depends on the species. So it could be anywhere from a year to reach adulthood, or 7, 8 years. Another question here. How many eggs are laid at once, and how long for eggs to hatch once they are laid? It's another really great question. So it depends on the snake. Some snakes will lay eggs in communal nests. So many females will use the same areas. For example, ringneck snakes, sometimes multiple species will use the same nesting sites. The number of eggs is really variable, and it's based on the body size. The bigger the female, the more eggs they can lay. And the eggs will hatch within the same season. So they'll typically lay, let's say June, July, and it might be about a month for incubation, but some of our snakes have very short incubation times. Smooth green snakes in particular, the eggs might hatch in less than 2 weeks. That's a really good question. Do all snakes shed their skins, and what time of year is this done? That's again, depends on the body size. Young baby snakes are going to shed very often because they're shedding as they grow. So it might be once a month, but adult snakes shed much less frequently. It might only be a couple times per year. They'll also shed more frequently if they have mechanical damage. So if the snake has been cut or has got bit by a mouse or something, it might shed more often. They typically won't shed during the winter, but all through the active season when the snakes are moving and going about their daily lives, they'll shed depending on how fast they're growing, once a month or once every few months. And you can often tell when a snake is about to shed their skin because their colors will become much more muted, and you'll often see the eye become cloudy. And that's because snakes don't have eyelids, but they do have a scale that covers the eye to protect it. And so you're seeing that fluid that's separating the old scale and the new scale, it kind of clouds their eyes right before they shed. These are really great questions. This is a quick question. There's a timber rattlesnake listed on the field guide. It was not covered. Just curious why. Timber rattlesnakes are native to Ontario. However, they are extirpated. So there hasn't been a live timber rattlesnake in Ontario for more than 50 years. And so I chose not to cover it because it's not a snake you're going to encounter. They had a fairly limited distribution within Ontario. They for sure occurred around the Niagara Gorge area, but they no longer occur there. And so timber rattlesnake would have been another venomous snake species, a much larger one than our Massasauga, over a meter long. They're found throughout the eastern United States, but they don't occur anymore in Ontario, and that's why I chose not to cover them. Another question, is the Y-shaped pattern on a milk snake's head always a useful clue? You know, I was debating whether I mention this. Most milk snakes have a Y-shaped pattern on top of the head, but not all of them do. So it can be useful, but I did not want to mislead folks in that occasionally the snakes don't have it, and it doesn't mean it's not a milk snake, but it can be useful. By that, I mean it's a brown blotch in the shape of a Y on the top of the head. Another question, quick one at the top here. Are Decays brown snakes common in Toronto? Yes, so brown snakes are relatively tolerant to habitat loss. So they still occur in many of our urban areas if there's like enough field and forest habitat. And so yes, Decays brown snakes can be found around Toronto, relatively close to the big city. Yeah. John, I don't know if you want to hold off on questions there. I've covered most of the ones
Yeah, I think this is probably a good time to take a break or to end the webinar. I don't want to run over time, be respectful of everybody. So thanks again. And thanks for everybody who joined in. As Kirsten said at the outset, our members really are the voice for nature in Ontario. So your support is why we're able to do the work we're doing and why we're effective at the work we do. So thank you. And thank you especially to James for volunteering his time to do this really informative presentation. So we'll be emailing the presentation around in the follow-up email in the next few days. So thanks everyone, and take care.